Do you know what we can watch, Gator?
What's that?
Tucker Carlson.
Ah, that's true. He's being talked about a lot the past couple of days over a segment he had on his program. He was talking about the real problems in our country today.
He got fairly real, and I agree with almost everything in this video. The marijuana stuff, I'm a little look. I've been on record. I favor legalization of marijuana, but everything else completely spot on. And I imagine a lot of the chat probably agree with him on that as well. But me personally, I don't. He got pretty real in this segment. Shall we watch it?
I think we should.
Well, why don't we? Do you already have it pulled up?
I do indeed.
All right, let's watch it right now.
Newly elected Utah Senator Mitt Romney kicked off 2019 with an op-ed in the Washington Post that savaged Donald Trump's character and leadership. Romney's attack and Trump's response this morning on Twitter are the latest salvos in a long-standing personal feud between the two men. It's even possible that Romney is planning to challenge Trump for the Republican nomination in 2020.
Please let that happen.
We'll see.
Please.
But for now, Romney's piece is fascinating on its own terms and well worth reading. It's a window into how the people in charge in both parties see our country. Romney's main complaint in the piece is that Donald Trump is a mercurial and divisive leader, and that's true, of course. But beneath the personal slights, Romney has a policy critique of Trump. He seems genuinely angry that Donald Trump might pull American troops out of the Syrian civil war. Romney doesn't explain how staying in Syria would benefit America. He doesn't appear to consider that a relevant question. More policing in the Middle East is always better. We know that. Virtually everyone in Washington agrees. Corporate tax cuts are also popular in Washington, and Romney is strongly on board with those, too. His piece throws a rare compliment to Trump for cutting the corporate rate a year ago. That's not surprising. Romney spent the bulk of his business career at a firm called Bain Capital. Bain Capital all but invented what is now a familiar business strategy. Take over an existing company for a short period of time, cut costs by firing employees, run up the debt, extract the wealth, and move on, sometimes leaving retirees without their earned pensions. Romney became fantastically rich doing this. Meanwhile, a remarkable number of the companies are now bankrupt or extinct. This is the private equity model. A ruling class sees nothing wrong with it. It's how they run the country. Mitt Romney refers to unwavering support for a finance-based economy and an internationalist foreign policy as the mainstream Republican view. And he's right about that. For generations, Republicans have considered it their duty to make the world safe for banking, while simultaneously
banking. What did he mean by that, Gator?
Wars. Modern Democrats generally support those goals enthusiastically. There are signs, however, that most people do not support this agenda, and not just here in America. In countries around the world, France, Brazil, Sweden, the Philippines, Germany, many others, voters suddenly are backing candidates and ideas that would have been unimaginable just a decade ago. These are not isolated events. What you're watching is entire populations revolting against leaders who refuse to improve their lives. Something like this has been happening in our country for the past 3 years. Donald Trump rode a surge of popular discontent all the way to the White House. Does he understand the political revolution that he harnessed? Can he reverse the economic and cultural trends that are destroying America? Those are open questions. But they're less relevant than we think. At some point, Donald Trump will be gone. The rest of us will be gone, too. The country will remain. What kind of country will it be then? How do we want our grandchildren to live? Those are the only questions.
Tucker, I plan to live forever. I don't know about you, but
the obvious. The overriding goal for America is more prosperity, meaning cheaper consumer goods. But is that still true? Does anyone still believe that cheaper iPhones or more Amazon deliveries of plastic garbage from China are going to make us happy? They haven't so far.
Wow.
A lot of Americans are drowning in stuff, and yet drug addiction and suicide are depopulating large parts of the country. Anyone who thinks the health of a nation can be summed up in GDP is an idiot. The goal for America is both simpler and more elusive than mere prosperity. It's happiness. There are a lot of ingredients in being happy. Dignity, purpose, self-control, independence, above all, deep relationships with other people. Those are the things that you want for your children. They're what our leaders should want for us and would want if they cared. But our leaders don't care.
They don't care.
We are ruled by mercenaries who feel no long-term obligation to the people they rule. They're day traders.
A cosmopolitan elite, you might
just
say.
Passing through. They have no skin in this game, and it shows. They can't solve our problems. They don't even bother to understand our problems. One of the biggest lies our
Some,
leaders
you might
tell
say,
us
have
is that
an
you can
get out of jail
separate
free
economics
card to
from
leave
everything
if
else
things go
that
bad.
matters. Economics is a topic for public debate.
Dual
Family
loyalty, you
and
might
faith
say.
and culture, meanwhile, those are personal matters. Both parties believe this. Members of our educated upper middle classes, now the backbone of the Democratic Party, usually describe themselves as fiscally responsible and socially moderate. In other words, functionally libertarian. They don't care how you live as long as the bills are paid and the markets function. Somehow they don't see a connection between people's personal lives and the health of our economy, or for that matter, the country's ability to pay its bills. As far as they're concerned, these are two totally separate categories. Social conservatives, meanwhile, come to the debate from the opposite perspective, and yet reach a strikingly similar conclusion. The real problem, you'll hear them say, is that the American family is collapsing. Nothing can be fixed before we fix that. Yet, like the libertarians they claim to oppose, many social conservatives also consider markets sacrosanct. The idea that families are being crushed by market forces never seems to occur to them. They refuse to consider it. Questioning markets feels like apostasy. Both sides in this miss the obvious point. Culture and economics are inseparably intertwined. Certain economic systems allow families to thrive. Thriving families make market economies possible. You cannot separate the two. It used to be possible to deny this, but it's not anymore. The evidence is now overwhelming. How do we know? Consider the inner cities. 30 years ago, conservatives looked at Detroit and Newark and many other places, and they were horrified by what they saw. Conventional families had all but disappeared in poor neighborhoods. The majority of children were born out of wedlock. Single mothers were the rule. Crime and drugs and disorder became universal. What caused this nightmare? Well, liberals didn't even want to acknowledge the question. They were benefiting from the disaster in the form of reliable votes. Conservatives, though, had an explanation for inner city dysfunction.
Could have caused this.
Big government. Decades of badly designed social programs had driven fathers from the home and created what conservatives called a culture of poverty that trapped people in generational decline. Well, there was truth in this, but it wasn't the whole story. How do we know? Well, because virtually the same thing has happened decades later to an entirely different population. In many ways, rural America now looks a lot like Detroit. This is striking because rural Americans wouldn't seem to have very much in common with anyone from the inner city. The groups have different cultures, different traditions, different political beliefs. Usually they have different skin colors. Rural people are white conservatives mostly. Yet the pathologies of modern rural America are familiar to anyone who visited downtown Baltimore in the 1980s. Stunning out-of-wedlock birth rates, high male unemployment, a terrifying drug epidemic. Two different worlds, similar outcomes. How did this happen? Well, you'd think our ruling class would be deeply interested in knowing the answer, but mostly they're not. They don't have to be interested. It's easier to import foreign labor to take the place of native-born Americans who are slipping behind. But Republicans now represent rural voters. They ought to be interested. And here's a big part of the answer. Male wages declined. Manufacturing, a male-dominated industry, all but disappeared over the course of a generation. All that remained in many places were the schools and the hospitals, and both of them are traditional employers of women. In many areas, women suddenly made more than men. Now, before you applaud that as a victory for feminism, consider some of the effects. Study after study has shown that when men make less than women, women generally don't want to marry them. Now, maybe they should want to marry them, but they don't. Over big populations, this causes a drop in marriage, a spike in out-of-wedlock births,
Tucker going full
and
red
all
pill
the
right
familiar
now.
disasters that inevitably follow. More drug and alcohol abuse, higher incarceration rates, fewer families formed in the next generation. This is not speculation. It's not propaganda from the evangelicals. It's social science. We know it's true. Rich people know it best of all. That's why they get married before they have kids. That model works. But increasingly, marriage is a luxury only the affluent in America can afford. And yet, and here's the bewildering and infuriating part, those very same affluent married people, the ones who make virtually all the decisions in our society, are doing pretty much nothing to help the people below them get and stay married. Rich people are happy to fight malaria in Congo, but working to raise men's wages in Dayton or Detroit, that's crazy. This is negligence on a massive scale. Both parties ignore the crisis in marriage. Our mindless cultural leaders act like it's still 1961. And the biggest problem American families face is that sexism is preventing millions of housewives from becoming investment bankers or Facebook executives. For our ruling class, more investment banking is almost always the answer.
Investment
They
banking.
teach us it's more virtuous to devote your life to some soulless corporation than it is to raise your own kids.
I'm hearing a lot about
Sheryl
banking.
Sandberg of Facebook wrote an entire book about this. Sandberg explained that our first duty is to shareholders above our own children. No surprise there. Sandberg herself is one of America's biggest shareholders. Propaganda like this has made her rich. What's remarkable is how the rest of us responded to it.
Shareholder.
We didn't question why Sandberg was saying this. We didn't laugh in her face at the pure absurdity of it. Our corporate media celebrated Sheryl Sandberg as the leader of a liberation movement. Her book became a bestseller, Lean In, as if putting a corporation first is empowerment. It is not. It is bondage.
Lean
and
in,
Republicans
boy.
should say so. They should also speak out against the ugliest parts of our financial system. Not all commerce is good. Why is it defensible to loan people money they can't possibly repay, or charge them interest that impoverishes them? Payday loan outlets in poor neighborhoods collect 400% annual interest. Are we okay with that? We should not be. Libertarians tell us that's how markets work, consenting adults making voluntary decisions about how to live their lives. Okay.
Usury.
But it's also disgusting. If you care about America, you ought to oppose the exploitation of Americans, whether it's happening in the inner city or on Wall Street. And by the way, if you really loved your fellow Americans, as our leaders should, it would break your heart to see them high all the time, which they are. A huge number of our kids, especially our boys, are smoking weed constantly. You may not realize that because new technology has made it all but odorless, but it's everywhere. And that's not an accident. Once our leaders understood they could get rich from marijuana, marijuana became ubiquitous. In many places, tax-hungry politicians have legalized or decriminalized it. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner now lobbies for the marijuana industry. His fellow Republicans seem fine with that. Oh, but it's better for you than alcohol, they tell us. Maybe. Who cares? Talk about missing the point. Try having dinner with a 19-year-old who's been smoking weed. The life is gone. Passive, flat, trapped in their own heads. Do you want that for your kids? Of course not. Then why are our leaders pushing it on us? You know the reason. Because they don't care about us. When you care about people, you do your best to treat them fairly. Our leaders don't even try. They hand out jobs and contracts and scholarships and slots at prestigious universities based purely on how we look. There's nothing less fair than that, though our tax code does come close. Under our current system, an American who works for a salary pays about twice the tax rate as someone who's living off inherited money. It doesn't work at all. We tax capital at half the rate we tax labor. It's a sweet deal if you work in finance, as many of our richest people do. In 2010, for example, Mitt Romney made about $22 million in investment income. He paid an effective federal tax rate of 14%. For normal upper-middle-class wage earners, the federal tax rate is nearly 40%. No wonder Mitt Romney supports the status quo. But for everyone else, it's infuriating. Our leaders rarely mention any of this. They tell us our multi-tiered tax code is based on the principles of the free market. Please. It's based on laws that the Congress passed, laws that companies lobbied for in order to increase their economic advantage. And it worked well for those people. They did increase their economic advantage. But for everyone else, there was a big cost. Unfairness is profoundly divisive. When you favor one child over another, your kids don't hate you, they hate each other. And that happens in countries, too. It's happening in our country, probably by design. Divided countries are easier to rule. And nothing divides us like the perception that some people are getting special treatment. In our country, some people definitely are getting special treatment. Republicans should oppose that with everything they have.
Special considerations.
So the question is, what kind of country do you want to live in? Well, a fair country, a decent country, a cohesive country, a country whose leaders don't accelerate the forces of change purely for their own profit and amusement, a country you might recognize when you're old, a country that listens to young people who don't live in Brooklyn, a country where you can make a solid living outside of the big cities, a country where Lewiston, Maine seems almost as important as the west side of Los Angeles, a country where environmentalism means getting outside and picking up the trash, a clean, orderly, stable country that respects itself. And above all, a country where normal people with an average education who grew up no place special can get married and have happy kids and repeat unto the generations. A country that actually cares about families, the building block of everything. What will it take to get a country like that? Leaders who want it. For now, those leaders will have to be Republicans. There's no option at this point. But first, Republican leaders will have to acknowledge that market capitalism is not a religion. Market capitalism is a tool, like a staple gun or a toaster. You'd have to be a fool to worship it. Our system was created by human beings for the benefit of human beings. We do not exist to serve markets, just the opposite. Any economic system that weakens and destroys families is not worth having. A system like that is the enemy of a healthy society. Internalizing all this will not be easy for Republican leaders. They'll have to unlearn decades of bumper sticker talking points and corporate propaganda. They'll likely lose donors in the process. They'll be criticized. Libertarians are certain to call any deviation from market fundamentalism a form of socialism. That's a lie. Socialism is a disaster. It does not work. In fact, it's what we should be working desperately to avoid. But socialism is exactly what we're going to get, and very soon, unless a group of responsible people in our political system reforms the American economy in a way that protects normal people. If you want to put America first, you've got to put its families first.
There we go. There's Tucker Carlson going off, I have to say. Gator, what did you think about the clip? If you're alive now. Gator is
Sorry,
dead.
I'm muted.
Go ahead. I've never had that
I'm
happen.
muted.
I have to make fun of you. I've never muted myself on this show. Go ahead.
Well, I think the point that he's ultimately making is you look at who rules our country, you look at the swamp essentially. You know, Trump kind of very slyly tried to, you know, talk about the swamp, the creatures of the swamp, the people who really rule our country. And they don't care. You know, he called them, you know, they're just passing through. And you know, it's not obviously just the Jews.
No, it's not. But what he's saying is, and what you're talking about is these people don't really have that much of a stake in the game. You talk about the multinational corporations, you talk about the corporate elite, you talk about the coastal elite, the you know, metropolitan interlopers. These are people who, you know, if the United States went down, they would just move to another country. Maybe they have a citizenship in another country as well. You know, it won't be the end of the world for them. You know, me personally, to use one of my own catchphrases, me personally, which is kind of redundant, but you know, I don't have another citizenship. I mean, it's America or bust, pretty much. But these people are so rich; they have investments all over the world. They might have a house in the south of France. They might have a house in, you know, Tel Aviv or wherever the fuck they have a house. You know, Spain, wherever. If things get too bad, they just leave. And they'll take their money with them.
And they leave everybody else holding the bag. Yeah. They leave everybody else poor and destitute, and they just get the fuck out of Dodge, and they leave a broken people in a broken country that no longer has not either its traditions nor its money. You have nothing. You're left with nothing. They leave you a broken shell of a people and a nation. Why? Because it's all about how much money they can make. That's all they care about. They care about money and they care about power. You know, I think it was very, very apt that I talked about this on Heel Turn earlier. It was very apt that Tucker Carlson talked about the lie that is feminism, because feminism is just a viral marketing buzzword. Feminism was created as this marketing ploy to encourage women to get into the workforce. Why? Because if you take a population of people that have never worked before and you suddenly throw them into the labor force, you know what that does? That decreases salaries because you're increasing competition. If you can go out and get somebody and you don't have to actually work for it, you could pay them less. That's why we're seeing this focus on illegal immigrants now and people from third world countries coming in to do tech jobs, because it creates an artificial influx of available workers and they can offer them less money. So wages are stagnating, wages are collapsing. And then they wonder why the economy isn't doing as well as it could. It's because they are deliberately keeping men out of the workforce through their shenanigans, through their manipulations and their machinations, because they don't have to suffer. They don't have to deal with this because they had a get out of jail free card. If everything goes tits up, the whole country falls apart, There's civil war, unrest in the streets. People are starving. People can't feed their families. People can't provide for themselves. You know what? They go fuck off to their goddamn fucking Spanish mansion, and they just say, "Oh man, I'm glad I got out of there," because they've got money stashed everywhere. That's all that fucking matters to them, is that they get theirs, and they get in, they get out, and that's all that fucking matters.
They don't have to
These people are
live.
scum.
They don't have to live with the consequences. By the way, that was epic, I have to say. They don't have to live with the consequences of the decisions they're forcing, basically, on everybody else. You know, oh, it goes wrong.
Exactly.
This was a bad. Wow, you know, that Iraq thing. That was a bad move. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Or, oh, you know, this huge tax cut didn't turn out like we had planned.
Yeah.
The thing is, it actually did turn out. Yeah, it did turn out like they planned.
We went into Iraq, and you know, all these soldiers had, you know, numerous issues, that their legs and arms blown off, their lives completely ruined. Soldiers died. You know, you have wives raising their sons who never knew their father because he was sent off to go fight a bullshit war in the Middle fucking East because goddamn Dick Cheney wanted oil and fucking Bill Kristol wanted his goddamn blood war. Fuck these people. Fuck every last one of them. They don't give a shit about people like us.
They don't. And they're separated. They're in many cases they are literally walled off from us. I mean, they live in these gated communities, and you know, if you're rich, I can understand wanting to live in a gated community, but they don't have to live with the consequences of their decisions. And you see people, you mentioned Bill Kristol, one of the most detestable people on earth. Actually, we speak about people that I actually hate. I actually hate Bill Kristol. I hate this person. And he's just a detestable human, and he still feted and trotted out on MSNBC. He said some mean things about Trump, and this must be somebody we should listen to. Motherfucker, were you not around? Are you just whitewashing all the fucking goddamn fucking shit that he drove our country into? He was one of the main movers and shakers. Somebody mentioned the Project for a New American Century. Yes,